On the night that was supposed to celebrate 20 years of marriage, a man walked into his own anniversary party with another woman on his arm and announced in front of every powerful family in New York that his wife was already replaceable. When gunmen stormed the estate minutes later, he grabbed his mistress and ran, leaving her behind without a single backward glance. But the woman he abandoned didn't collapse. She took command. And by the time the smoke cleared, every man in that room understood they had been following the wrong person for 20 years. If you want to see how a woman who was left behind becomes the one everyone chooses to follow, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The chandeliers were too bright. That was the first thing Vivian noticed when she stepped into the ballroom of the Moretti estate. The light was wrong, too sharp, too eager. The kind of illumination that flattered marble floors and crystal stemware, but exposed every line on a woman's face that her husband had stopped looking at years ago. She paused at the top of the grand staircase and let the room settle into her vision the way she always did, slow and methodical, the way her father had taught her before his world caved in around him and left her with nothing but that one lesson: read the room before it reads you. 214 people below her. She had counted the RSVPs herself. 12 mafia families represented, from the Costellos of Brooklyn to the Reinhardts out of Philadelphia to old Paulo Ferreira, who hadn't left his compound in Queens in 3 years, but had made the drive tonight because 20 years of the Moretti Empire demanded acknowledgement. Round tables dressed in ivory linen, towering floral arrangements of white roses and black orchids. Her selections chosen 6 weeks ago when the evening still meant something. String quartet in the northeast corner playing something European and forgettable. Staff moving through the crowd with practiced invisibility, the way good help always did, the way Vivian herself had learned to move through rooms like these. She wore a deep burgundy gown, structured at the shoulder, clean at the hip. No jewelry except the single strand of pearls Damien's mother had pressed into her hands at their wedding. She had almost left them upstairs tonight. She wasn't sure now why she hadn't. Damien was not at the bottom of the stairs waiting for her. She had known he wouldn't be. She had known for 11 days, since the Tuesday afternoon she found a dry cleaning receipt in the pocket of his gray overcoat for a suit she had never seen, and a hotel address she recognized immediately because she had once approved its security profile for a meeting between the Moretti family and the Conti representatives 3 years prior. She had stood in their kitchen with that receipt in her hand for 4 minutes and 40 seconds. She had counted the way she counted everything, and then she had folded it neatly and placed it back exactly where she found it and continued making the phone calls she needed to make. She descended the staircase now, with her spine perfectly straight and her face arranged into the careful neutral expression she had spent 2 decades perfecting, the one that gave away nothing, the one that had sat across from men who wanted her husband dead and made them believe she was simply a gracious hostess pouring wine. Halfway down, she saw him. Damien Moretti stood near the center of the room in a charcoal suit that had been tailored recently. She could tell by the way the shoulders sat, different from anything in his wardrobe as of 6 weeks ago. He was 51 years old, and he wore it the way men like him always wore their age, like an asset, silver threading through his dark hair at the temples, jaw still hard, posture still carrying the particular authority of a man who had never once in his adult life been required to shrink for anyone. He was laughing at something. His hand was resting at the small of a woman's back. Celeste Vaughn was 34. Vivian knew her height, weight, dress size, the name of her colorist in Tribeca, the building where she kept her apartment in the West 60s, and the fact that she had a younger brother in debt to a loan operation connected loosely to the Reinhardt family. Vivian had assembled this information over the course of 9 days, not out of jealousy, but out of habit. She assembled information the way some women collected shoes. It kept her alive. It had always kept her alive. Celeste was wearing cobalt blue, backless, and she was beautiful the way certain women are beautiful. Immediately, obviously, the kind of beauty that announces itself before the woman even speaks. She was leaning slightly into Damien's space, one hand resting on his forearm, laughing at something he said, and Vivian watched the room react to the two of them the way a room always reacts when it senses something wrong but cannot yet articulate the wrongness. Conversations slowed, eyes tracked. The string quartet played on. Vivian reached the bottom of the staircase. Marco Fiore found her first, because Marco always found her first. He was 63 years old and had served the Moretti family for 38 of them, and his loyalty had long since transferred from the institution to the person he believed actually held it together. He materialized at her left elbow with a champagne flute extended, and his face doing something complicated. "Mrs. Moretti?" "Marco." She took the glass, did not drink from it. "How long has she been here?" "She arrived with him." A pause waited with everything he couldn't say in a room full of witnesses. 40 minutes ago. 40 minutes. Damien had been inside this estate, her estate, the house she had managed and protected and bled for, with that woman on his arm for 40 minutes before Vivian descended the stairs. She processed this the way she processed most things that hurt. She filed it somewhere deep and turned her attention to what was actionable. "Who's noticed?" "Everyone." Marco's voice was low and tight. "Ferreira hasn't touched his drink. The Costellos are watching the exits. Young Reinhardt hasn't taken his eyes off Don Damien since he walked in." None of that was good. When men like Reinhardt started watching exits and tracking their host's movements, they were calculating exposure, risk. They were asking themselves whether tonight's venue was still safe, whether the alliance that brought them here still meant what it had meant when they made the drive. "Get me to the east corner before he sees me on the floor," Vivian said quietly. Marco moved, and she moved with him, angling through the crowd with the kind of easy sociability that was entirely performance, touching shoulders, exchanging names, leaning in to hear some aging Don's comment about the floral arrangements. She had hosted enough of these evenings to do it in her sleep. She had hosted enough of them to know that a room like this, full of armed men with long memories and short tolerance for disrespect, could turn in under 3 minutes when the wrong thing happened. She did not make it to the east corner. Damien's voice cut through the room via the wireless microphone she had arranged to be available at the head table for the toast she had written for him 3 weeks ago, the one she had kept handwritten on ivory cardstock in her desk upstairs, the one that referenced 20 years and the particular texture of a life built together. He had not asked her for a toast. He had simply lifted the microphone from the table where it sat and tapped it once. The room went quiet with the instinctive discipline of people who understood that when a Don took a microphone, you stopped talking. "Thank you all for being here tonight." Damien's voice was steady, warm, even. He had always been good at warm when he needed it. 20 years is a long time, long enough to understand some things about yourself, long enough to know when a chapter needs to close. Vivian was standing 40 feet away from him. She could not see his face clearly from this angle, but she could see Celeste beside him, and she watched Celeste's chin lift with something that looked almost like nervousness. Not guilt, not quite, but the performance of a woman who had rehearsed her entrance and was now waiting for her cue. "I've spent the last several months doing something I should have done a long time ago," Damien continued. Around the room, the silence had gone from respectful to something else, something tense and uncertain. "Making an honest decision. A man in my position can't afford to operate on anything less." He raised his glass. "I want you all to meet Celeste Vaughn. She'll be standing beside me going forward. Once the legal matters are settled, she'll be the woman at the head of this family." No one moved. The silence that followed was not the polite silence of a room absorbing a toast. It was the specific silence of 200 people recalibrating simultaneously, the silence of men who had built entire empires on their ability to read power correctly, suddenly discovering that the floor had shifted under their feet without warning. Vivian heard someone set a glass down very carefully. She heard the string quartet trail off mid-phrase, the cellist losing his place. She heard nothing from her own chest at all. It had gone very still in there, the way things go still sometimes just before they break. Every eye in the room found her. She felt it before she saw it. The collective pivot, the instinctive human need to locate the person being discussed, to read her reaction, to understand whether this room was about to become a dangerous place. She was standing near the east wall with a champagne flute in her hand and Marco at her elbow, and the Castellano wife, 4 feet to her left, had gone the color of old wax. Vivian took a breath. She did not grip the champagne flute harder. She did not let her face do anything except remain exactly as it was, composed, present, unreadable. She had been trained for worse than this. She had stood in rooms where men debated whether she should be allowed to leave alive. She had negotiated across tables where 3 of the 4 people seated were considering having her husband killed. She had held her son's hand in an emergency room at 3 in the morning when he was 9 years old and the doctors were using words she had forced herself to understand immediately. And she had not broken then either. She was not going to break in front of 200 witnesses because her husband had decided to use their anniversary party as the venue for his announcement. She set the champagne flute down on the nearest surface, which happened to be the edge of the buffet table, and she straightened her shoulders, and she found Damien's eyes across the room because she had learned long ago that the worst thing a woman in her position could do was appear to be hiding from anything. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. She counted. Then he looked away. It was the looking away that told her everything she still needed to know. Not the announcement. She had anticipated some version of that, or had begun to. It was the way his eyes left hers with so little difficulty, the way she disappeared from his line of sight without apparent effort, the casual ease of a man releasing something he had already decided wasn't worth the wait. Marco's hand was at her elbow, not gripping, just present. "Mrs. Moretti?" he said very quietly. "I'm fine," she said, just as quietly, and the thing was, she almost was. She was not fine the way a person is fine when nothing is wrong. She was fine the way a building is fine in the first seconds after the foundation cracks, still upright, still structurally coherent, still capable of housing everyone inside it, just fundamentally changed in some deep internal way that the exterior hadn't yet registered. What she was thinking about in that moment was not Damien. It was the room. It was Paulo Ferreira's face, which had gone from cautious to something harder and more calculating. It was the way the younger Reinhardt was now speaking quietly to his underboss with his eyes still on Damien, the way you speak to someone when you're revising an assessment in real time. It was the Castellano wife, whose discomfort was visible enough that her husband had moved to stand closer to her in the instinctive way men do when they sense a room changing temperature. These families had come here tonight with a specific understanding of what the Moretti Empire was and who stood at its center. Damien had just revised that understanding without consultation, without warning, and without the basic political intelligence to understand what that kind of unilateral move communicated to men who measured everything in terms of control and predictability. He had not just humiliated his wife in front of the assembled leadership of New York's organized crime infrastructure. He had demonstrated that he was capable of making significant unilateral decisions without regard for his allies' investment in stability. He had shown them, without intending to, that the man they had trusted their alliances to operated on impulse and personal desire when it suited him. Vivian understood this room far better than her husband did. She had always understood it better than he did, and he had always, on some level, resented that understanding even as he relied on it. She was about to do something with that understanding when the windows exploded. It was not a single sound. It was multiple simultaneous detonations. The tall ballroom windows on the south and east walls shattering inward with the particular violence of something high velocity passing through glass. And then the secondary sound, the sound that rewrote everything, the sound of automatic weapons fire in an enclosed marble and crystal space, which is nothing like it sounds in films. It is percussive and physical, and it hits the chest like a fist, and the first thing it does is eliminate the ability to think clearly, which is its entire function. The room erupted. 200 people moving simultaneously in a space not designed for emergency egress is not chaos in the romantic sense. It is something uglier and more mechanical, bodies colliding with furniture, stemware and flower arrangements going over, women losing their shoes, men reaching for weapons some of them hadn't expected to need tonight. The string quartet platform went over. The lights flickered once and held, which was almost worse than if they had gone out, because everyone could see everything. Vivian was already moving before the second volley. Not toward the exits. The exits were where everyone else was moving, which made them the most dangerous places in the room right now. Not toward Damien. She registered, in the peripheral sweep she performed in the first 3 seconds, that Damien had grabbed Celeste's wrist and was pulling her toward the north corridor, the one that led to the private garage where the armored vehicles were kept, moving fast and not looking back. She moved toward the kitchen corridor. Marco was with her, and two of the household security staff she had personally vetted and trained fell in immediately without being summoned because she had spent years building the kind of relationships where men and women knew what to do when she moved with purpose. This was not an accident. This was infrastructure. The kitchen corridor was clear, and she took it at a pace that was not running. Running communicated panic, and panic was contagious and fatal in confined spaces, but was fast and deliberate, and she had her phone in her hand before she cleared the kitchen doors, her thumb moving to a contact that did not appear under any obvious name in her directory. The call connected on the second ring. "Tell me your status," she said without preamble. The voice on the other end was female, controlled, and spoke with the clipped efficiency of someone who had also been waiting for this call. "We have 6 active shooters confirmed on the south perimeter, minimum 2 on the east exterior. They came in through the service road. Someone gave them the access code for the maintenance gate." The guests. "We're already routing through the sub-level. Mateo has the north tunnel open. The children are with Elena. I have Ferreira's granddaughters already in the van." Vivian processed this in the 2 seconds it took her to push through the kitchen doors. "What about the Castellano family?" "Still in the ballroom. Their security team went down in the first exchange." "Send Torres. He knows the Castellano underboss personally. They'll follow him. Route them through the wine cellar access, not the kitchen. If there are shooters working the east wall, they'll be covering the kitchen exit." "Copy." She ended the call and made another before the phone had fully left her ear, and then another, and each call was short, and each call activated something or someone or some specific piece of a network that she had spent 12 years quietly constructing with the particular care of a woman who understood that in a world built on male authority and male violence, a woman's only viable insurance policy was the kind of power that didn't look like power from the outside. In the sub-level below the Moretti estate, a series of tunnel access points were opening. In 3 vehicles parked on a maintenance road 3 blocks east, engines were starting. In the ballroom above, 2 members of the household staff who had spent the last 8 years serving canapes and refilling water glasses were revealing themselves to be something considerably more than that, moving through the room with the authority of trained security personnel, guiding clusters of panicked guests towards specific corridors, while the men with guns in those clusters were still trying to remember which direction the firing was coming from. Vivian had built this. She had built it in the margins of her marriage, in the hours between the obligations that defined her visible life, in the spaces between being a Don's wife and being herself. She had built it because 12 years ago, she had sat in a room where a woman she knew, a woman who had committed no crime except marrying badly, had been killed in the crossfire of a dispute she had no part in, and Vivian had understood in that moment that the system she lived inside had no mechanism for protecting the people it viewed as incidental. So she had built one. The network had no official name. Among the people who were part of it, it was referred to in terms so mundane they were effectively invisible. The committee, the arrangement, the channel. It handled emergency evacuations. It maintained safe houses. It provided medical access and legal support for women and children caught in the machinery of families like hers. Every major family in the New York infrastructure had at least 2 or 3 people who participated, not because their dons knew about it and approved, but because those individual people had decided, privately and at some personal risk, that there were things worth doing outside the official architecture of their loyalty. The dons did not know, or they had not known, until tonight, which was the night everything changed in ways that no one in that ballroom had anticipated when they dressed for an anniversary party. Vivian moved through the basement level of her own house with the particular confidence of a person who has memorized every exit, because she had. She paused twice, once to redirect a panicked sous chef toward the correct tunnel access, once to assess a security report that came through her earpiece, a small device she had placed in her left ear in the kitchen that no one had noticed because no one ever noticed what she did with her left ear, or her left hand, or really, any part of her that wasn't her face. The report told her that the north tunnel was clear and the vehicle convoy was moving. It told her that 12 of the 14 children who had been present in the estate tonight were already outside the perimeter. It told her that the 2 remaining were the youngest Ferreira grandchildren, who had been in the garden when the shooting started and had been pulled into a groundskeeper's outbuilding by a woman named Rosa, who had worked the Moretti grounds for 9 years and knew exactly what to do because Vivian had walked through this scenario with her 14 months ago. It told her that Damien's armored SUV had left the private garage 6 minutes ago. He had not called her. He had not sent anyone back for her. He had taken the most heavily armored vehicle on the property and left with Celeste Vaughn and 2 of his personal security men, and he had not, as far as anyone could determine, looked back at the building where 200 people were still under fire. She stood in the sub-level corridor for a moment, and she let that information settle into her the way cold water settles into a closed space, thoroughly, finding every crack. She did not assign it an emotion yet. There wasn't time for emotion yet. There was a Ferreira granddaughter in a groundskeeper's shed and a room full of men upstairs who needed to not die tonight. An emotion was a luxury she would pick up later from wherever she ended up leaving it. She found the earpiece again. I need eyes on the East Garden outbuilding. Rosa and 2 children. We see them. Torres is 40 seconds out. Tell him to come in from the north side. If they've got a shooter on the east wall, he'll be exposed from the south approach. Relaying now. Above her, the shooting was changing rhythm. She had been tracking it through the earpiece and through the subterranean percussion of close-range gunfire transmitted through marble and concrete. And what she was hearing now was fewer concentrated bursts and more isolated exchanges, which meant the estate's perimeter defenses had engaged and the attackers were no longer operating from unified positions. They were fragmenting, which meant the worst of it was passing, which meant she had approximately 4 minutes before the calculus changed again. She made a decision and went back upstairs. The ballroom was transformed in the way that rooms are transformed by violence. The careful orchestration of the evening dissolved into something raw and functional, overturned furniture now serving as cover, the wounded attended to by whoever had medical training or the nerve to hold pressure on something. The flowers were mostly on the floor. One of the chandeliers had taken damage and listed slightly to the north, its crystals singing softly against each other in the draft from the broken windows. Several of the dons were still there. Paulo Ferreira, who moved with difficulty, had not made it to any exit and was seated against the far wall with his consigliere beside him, his face the face of a man who had lived long enough in violent circumstances to have made his peace with them, but was still, at 81, capable of fear. The Castellano family's senior don had a cut above his eye from flying glass and was standing with 3 of his remaining security men in the center of the room with his weapon out, pointing it in the general direction of the south windows with the particular expression of a man who wants something to aim at. They both looked at Vivian when she came through the service door. Ferreira's consigliere started to say something, and Vivian held up one hand without breaking stride, moving toward the south windows to assess the exterior, and something about the authority of that gesture, the single raised hand of a woman who had just walked through a firefight in a burgundy gown and hadn't changed expression, stopped the consigliere mid-sentence. "The tunnels are clear," she said, addressing both dons without preamble. "Sub-level access through the kitchen corridor. There are vehicles waiting 3 blocks east on the maintenance road." "Your granddaughters are already in the convoy, Don Ferreira. Don Castellano, your family is being routed through the wine cellar access right now." Ferreira looked at her for a long moment. In 30 years of knowing Vivian Moretti, he had never seen this version of her. He had seen the hostess, the wife, the composed and gracious woman at the end of his host's table. He was looking now at something else, something that had apparently been there the whole time underneath the graciousness, and at 81 he was wise enough to understand what that meant about the last 2 decades. "Your network," he said. It was not quite a question. "We can discuss it when we're out," Vivian said. "Right now I need you both to move." They moved. Outside, the gunfire had fallen to 2 isolated exchanges. Mop-up sounds, the sound of an operation failing on its own terms. The convoy on the maintenance road was already moving. 12 members of 5 different families would arrive at 3 separate safe houses in the next 40 minutes, and none of those safe houses existed in any documentation that bore the Moretti family name. In the private garage, Damien Moretti's armored SUV was already 11 miles away and accelerating, and somewhere in the wreckage of her 20-year anniversary party, surrounded by broken crystal and fallen flowers, and the men who had just watched her hold the line while her husband fled, Vivian Moretti was beginning to understand that the night Damien Moretti tried to replace her was the night she stopped needing to be replaced at all, and that what she had built in secret over 12 years was not a safety net. It was a throne. She just hadn't sat in it yet. But what none of them knew, not Ferreira with his calculating eyes, not the Castellano Don still gripping his weapon in the ruined ballroom, not Damien speeding north with Celeste's hand in his, was how the attackers had known about the maintenance gate, who had given them the access code, and why the attack had been timed to the exact minute that the entire assembled leadership of New York's most powerful families was standing in one room. The answer to those questions was sitting in the passenger seat of an armored SUV, checking her lipstick in the visor mirror, with absolutely no idea what she had done. The safe house on Meridian Street smelled like dust and old radiator heat, and the particular staleness of a space that had been maintained without being lived in, which was exactly what it was. A 3-story brownstone that appeared in city records as a property held by a mid-tier real estate management company that did not, in any meaningful sense, exist. Vivian had acquired it 7 years ago through 4 layers of corporate structure and a lawyer in Newark who understood that some clients paid for discretion the way other clients paid for speed. She had never stayed here herself. She had hoped she would never need to. She needed to now. The living room on the second floor held 11 people. Paulo Ferreira sat in the only armchair which Marco had angled toward the door out of habit, because men like Ferreira had spent their entire lives positioning themselves with their backs to walls and their eyes on exits. His consigliere, a compact man named Ruiz, who spoke rarely and observed everything, stood at his right shoulder. Don Castellano, whose name was Enzo and who Vivian had known for 16 years and never once trusted completely, sat on the edge of the couch with a white dish towel pressed to the cut above his eye, the towel going dark at the center in a way that meant he probably needed stitches but was not going to say so. His underboss stood near the window. 2 of Vivian's network coordinators, women who had arrived within 12 minutes of the convoy because they had been staged and waiting, moved through the space with quiet efficiency, delivering water, reporting status through earpieces, doing the 100 small things that kept a crisis from calcifying into catastrophe. Nobody was talking. That was the first problem. Vivian stood near the doorway with her heels finally off, set aside on the landing because she had made a practical decision somewhere between the estate's sublevel and the back seat of the evacuation vehicle that she was not going to manage the next several hours in 3-inch heels, and if anyone in this room had an opinion about that, they were welcome to voice it and discover what happened next. Her feet on the bare floor, her pearls still at her throat, her phone in her hand showing 47 missed calls, 14 of which were from a number she didn't recognize, and 4 of which were from Damien, all placed within the last 22 minutes. She had not answered any of them. "Someone needs to say something," Enzo Castellano said finally, his voice roughened by the evening. He pulled the towel from his eye and looked at the red center of it with the expression of a man cataloging damage. "Because I am sitting in a house I didn't know existed, driven here by people I didn't know worked for you, and I watched half my security team go down and in a room where I was supposed to be a guest. I need someone to explain to me what tonight actually was." "An attack," Vivian said. "I know it was an attack." His voice had an edge now. "I want to know who planned it. I want to know how they knew we were all going to be in that room at the same time. I want to know who gave them the gate code because your husband's security was supposed to be the best in the city and somebody walked right through it." "I'm working on that." "Working on it." He repeated it the way people repeat things when the words taste wrong. 12 families represented tonight, Vivian. 12. You understand what it would have meant if those shooters had been better? If they'd hit the ballroom instead of the windows first? She understood. She had been understanding it for the last hour and a half in the part of her mind that ran calculations continuously whether she wanted it to or not. If the first volley had targeted the crowd instead of the glass, if the point had been mass casualties rather than chaos, the assembled leadership of New York's organized crime infrastructure could have been reduced by 60% in under 4 minutes. It would have been the single most significant power shift in the city's underworld in 40 years. They had not done that, which meant the objective had not been elimination. The objective had been something else, and she was still working out what. "Where's your husband?" Ferreira asked. He had not moved from the armchair. His voice was mild in the way that very old men's voices sometimes go mild when they are being most dangerous. "En route to the secondary estate in Connecticut, as far as I can determine." "He left." It was not a question. "Yes." A silence moved through the room like weather. "He left," Ferreira said again, slower, as if he were testing the weight of the words. "He walked out of that building while my granddaughters were still inside it." "Your granddaughters are safe. They're in the vehicle behind this one. They'll be here in 6 minutes." "I know they're safe." For the first time, something sharpened in the old man's eyes. "I know they're safe because of you. I am asking you to confirm, in front of witnesses, that the Dawn of the Moretti family left this building under active fire without verifying the status of his guests." The room had gone very still. Vivian looked at Ferreira and understood exactly what he was doing and why he was doing it. And she understood that her answer in this moment was not simply a statement of fact, but a brick in an architecture that the old man was already constructing with the methodical patience of someone who had been building things like this for 60 years. He wanted it said aloud. He wanted it witnessed. He wanted the shape of Damien's failure named and acknowledged in a room full of people who would carry the naming of it forward. "Yes," she said. "He left. He took the north garage exit with 2 personal security staff and 1 civilian. To my knowledge, he did not verify guest status before departing." The underboss near the window made a sound that was not quite a word. Enzo Castellano set the dish towel down on the couch beside him. "1 civilian," he said carefully. "The woman." "Yes." Another silence, shorter this time, tighter. "I've known Damien Moretti for 22 years, Castellano said. "I have never once questioned his judgment in a crisis. I have never once had reason to." He paused. "I am having reason to now." Ruiz, the consigliere, spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet and precise. "Mrs. Moretti, the network you used tonight, the evacuations, the tunnels, the vehicles, the personnel, how long has this been operational?" 12 years. The number landed in the room like something thrown. 12 years, Ruiz repeated. "The infrastructure has been built incrementally. Tunnel access was established in year 3. The vehicle network came online in year 6. Personnel training has been ongoing. And Don Moretti," Ruiz paused very carefully. "Was he aware of this network?" The question was precise and it was deliberate, and it was the question that everything else tonight would hinge on, and everyone in the room knew it. "No," Vivian said. The word fell into absolute silence and stayed there. Castellano stood up from the couch. He was 60 years old and broad across the shoulders, and there was blood drying above his eye, and he looked at Vivian with an expression she had never seen from him before. Not the careful social regard of a fellow family leader's wife, not the polite neutrality of a man managing a peer relationship, but something rawer and more direct. The look of a man genuinely recalibrating. "You built a network that covers 12 families," he said, "without your husband's knowledge, for 12 years. I built a humanitarian protection network. The families it covers are incidental to its function." That is a very careful sentence. "I'm a careful person." His mouth moved towards something that was almost not a smile. "Apparently." He looked at Ferreira, then back at her. "What do you need from us right now?" It was the right question, and the fact that he was asking it, instead of the dozen other questions he could have asked, about authority, about jurisdiction, about the fundamental strangeness of a woman having run a covert operation under all their noses for over a decade, told her that Enzo Castellano was, whatever else he was, a pragmatist first. "I need 2 things, she said. "I need everyone in this room to maintain communication silence regarding tonight's details until I have a clear picture of how the attack was coordinated. And I need someone to tell me who among the families represented tonight has a connection to the Solano operation out of Newark." The temperature in the room changed. Ferreira's eyes moved. Ruiz went very still. Castellano's expression shifted into something careful and closed. the face of a man who had just heard something he hadn't expected and was deciding how to respond to it. "That's a specific name," Castellano said. "I have specific reasons for it. The Solano operation has been quiet for 3 years. It's been quiet in the ways that are visible," Vivian said. "I have reason to believe it has not been quiet in the ways that aren't." She did not tell them yet what that reason was. She had learned very early that information released too quickly loses its leverage, and she still needed leverage because the night was not over, and she did not yet know how many people in this room were entirely what they appeared to be. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. A message from a contact listed as MT, which was not the person's name but a reference she would recognize. 3 words. They found the router. She kept her face exactly as it was and put the phone in her pocket. "Give me 30 minutes, she said to the room. "I need to make some calls." She took the calls in the kitchen on the ground floor, standing at the counter with a glass of water she didn't drink, speaking in a voice low enough that it didn't carry past the doorway. The information that came in over the next 28 minutes assembled itself into a picture she had begun sketching in her mind during the convoy drive, but had hoped would resolve into something less ugly than it was resolving into. The attackers had used the maintenance gate access code. That code was changed every 72 hours and was known to exactly 11 people, all of them Moretti household security staff or senior personnel. The previous code change had been logged 41 hours ago. The attack had come tonight, which meant the breach was recent, within the last 2 days. The maintenance gate access code had been shared 6 weeks ago in a security briefing that Damien had insisted on attending with Celeste Vaughn present, because he had decided she needed to understand the estate's infrastructure in preparation for her eventual role. 3 members of the security staff had raised objections to a civilian's presence at that briefing and had been overruled. Vivian stood at the kitchen counter and absorbed this information and felt something move through her that was colder and more focused than anger. Anger was a blunt instrument. What she felt now was something more like the crystallization of a suspicion she had been refusing to fully form for weeks, the moment when the shape you've been half seeing in peripheral vision finally resolves into something with edges and weight. She called a number that connected to a woman in a walk-up apartment in Hoboken who handled the network's intelligence function and had never once in 9 years been wrong about something that mattered. "The briefing," Vivian said without preamble. "I know. I've been pulling the surveillance footage for the last hour." A pause. "Vivian, she recorded it." The kitchen was very quiet. "Tell me exactly what you mean by that." "There's a 6-second window in the footage from the hallway outside the briefing room where she's alone. Phone comes out, phone goes away. The angle isn't perfect, but the timestamp and the duration are consistent with a screen recording of something on a table in front of her. She recorded the briefing. I can't prove she transmitted it intentionally. It's possible she was recording for personal reference and someone accessed her phone. It's possible she shared it without understanding what she was sharing. But yes, she recorded the security briefing, and someone used that recording to coordinate tonight's attack." Vivian set the glass of water down very carefully on the counter. "Where is she right now?" "Connecticut Estate. She arrived with Don Moretti approximately 40 minutes ago." "Is my husband aware of what you just told me?" "Not from us. Keep it that way until I say otherwise." She paused. "Get me everything you can on her phone activity for the last 60 days, calls, messages, application usage. I want to know who she's been talking to and how often. That's going to take however long it takes. Call me when you have something." She ended the call and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands flat on the counter and her eyes on the middle distance in the silence of the house around her, and she allowed herself, for the space of perhaps 15 seconds, to feel the full weight of what the evening had cost. Not the marriage. She had been making her peace with the end of that for longer than she would have admitted to anyone. But the estate, the network's exposure, the controlled revelation of something she had intended to protect indefinitely because its value was partly in its invisibility. The faces of the Dons upstairs recalibrating everything they thought they knew about the woman they had spent 20 years looking past. She had not chosen tonight for any of this, but tonight had chosen her. She pushed off the counter and went back upstairs. Ferreira's granddaughters had arrived. They were 12 and 9 years old, and they were sitting on either side of their grandfather in the armchair, one of them asleep against his shoulder with the boneless total sleep of children who have exhausted every available resource of fear and adrenaline. The other, watching the room with eyes that were too alert and too old for her face. Ferreira had one arm around each of them, and he was looking at Vivian over the head of the sleeping one with an expression that she had never expected to see on Paulo Ferreira's face, which was gratitude of the completely unguarded kind. The gratitude of a man who has been reminded that there are still things he cannot protect alone. She gave him a small nod, and he returned it, and that was enough. Castellano's underboss had taken a call from somewhere and was speaking in urgent undertones near the window. Castellano himself was now on his feet, moving the way men like him moved when they were thinking with their bodies, back and forth, contained, burning off something. He stopped when Vivian came in. "My security chief is telling me we lost 2 men tonight," he said. The rawness in his voice was not entirely grief, though it was partly that. It was also fury, the particular fury of a man who has paid a price he did not agree to pay. "Good men, 20 years each. I'm sorry. I want to know who sent those shooters." His voice dropped a register. "And I want to know before your husband gets to that information first, because right now I'm not confident that what's good for Damian Moretti and what's good for my family are the same thing. They used to be. Tonight changed that." "I know who authorized the attack," Vivian said. The room stopped. Castellano looked at her. Ferreira opened his eyes fully. Even the sleeping granddaughter stirred slightly, some animal instinct registering the change in the room's atmosphere. "Solano, Vivian said. "Marco Solano. But that's not the part that matters most." "What's the part that matters most?" Ferreira asked. She took a breath, not because she needed to compose herself. She was past that point, had pushed through it somewhere in the kitchen downstairs, but because what she was about to say was the kind of thing that, once said, could not be unsaid, and she had spent 12 years understanding that words in rooms like this had mass and permanence, that they altered the physical structure of alliances and loyalties in ways that no subsequent statement could entirely reverse. The part that matters most is that the security information Solano used to plan tonight's attack was obtained through a breach that occurred in this estate 6 weeks ago. And the breach occurred because someone was present at a restricted security briefing who should not have been there. Castellano was very still. "Who?" Vivian looked at him steadily. Celeste Vaughn recorded the briefing on her phone. That recording made its way to Solano's people. I don't yet know whether she knew what she was doing or whether her phone was compromised without her knowledge, but the causal chain is not in dispute. She was the point of entry. The underboss near the window stopped his call. He turned around slowly. Castellano sat back down on the couch with the deliberate care of a man making sure his legs are going to hold him before he fully commits his weight. He pressed both hands flat on his thighs and stared at the floor for a long moment. "Your husband's mistress," he said very quietly, "burned the security of his own estate. To the best of my current information, yes. And he is currently at the Connecticut property." A pause. "With her." "Yes." Another silence. This one had a different quality. Not the silence of shock, which moves fast and breaks quickly, but the silence of men arriving at conclusions and deciding what to do with them, which moves slowly and lands hard. "He doesn't know," Ferreira said. "Not yet." The old man looked at her for a long time. The sleeping granddaughter had resettled against his shoulder without waking. He lifted one hand and smoothed the child's hair back from her face with a gentleness that sat strangely against the rest of the evening. And then he looked back at Vivian with eyes that had seen 60 years of this particular world and had stopped being surprised by very much of it, except, apparently, by her. "What do you intend to do?" he asked. It was the question. Not what would Damian do, not what would the families do, not what would the proper hierarchy of authority dictate. What did she intend to do? He was asking her because he had already, in the space of a single catastrophic evening, made the adjustment that Enzo Castellano was still working toward. He had identified where the competence actually lived in the Moretti family, and he was directing his question accordingly. She opened her mouth to answer. Her phone rang. The number on the screen was not one she recognized, but the area code was Connecticut, and when she answered it and heard the voice on the other end, Everything she had been about to say dissolved into something that required complete and immediate reassessment, because the voice was Damien's, and what he said in the first 4 seconds told her that someone had gotten to the Connecticut estate before he did, and that the people who had been at her anniversary party tonight had not finished what they came to do. Damien's voice on the phone was wrong in a way that took Vivian approximately 2 seconds to identify, and what made it wrong was not volume or speed, but texture. The quality of a man who had spent 30 years never once sounding uncertain, now sounding exactly that, uncertain and tight, and stripped of the particular confidence that had always been so fundamental to his presence that she had sometimes confused it with competence. "There are men outside the Connecticut property," he said. "4 vehicles. They've been there since before I arrived." Vivian turned away from the room and took 3 steps toward the kitchen doorway, putting her back to Ferreira and Castellano. Not for their benefit. For hers. What her face was doing right now was not something she wanted witnessed. "How many personnel do you have with you?" "Castellano lent me 2 of his—" He stopped. "My 2 plus Reyes. 3 men. Against 4 vehicles that could hold anywhere between 8 and 20 depending on configuration." "Have they made contact?" "No, they're parked. Watching. They're not there to move tonight," she said, and she believed this as she said it, because if Solano's people had wanted Damien dead in the driveway of the Connecticut estate, they would have done it already. The parking, the watching, that was a message, an enclosure. They were showing him the walls of the box before they decided what to do with him inside it. "Vivian," his voice changed again. Something moved through it that she identified slowly and with a kind of distant surprise as fear. Not the fear of violence. Damien Moretti had never been afraid of violence. The fear of something more foundational, the fear of a man realizing that the structures he believed were holding him up had already been quietly dismantled while he wasn't paying attention. "What happened tonight?" "The attack." "Do you know who—" "Yes." A pause. "Who?" She looked at the kitchen doorway. Through it, she could see Marco's shoulder and the edge of the living room, and Ferreira's hand resting on his granddaughter's hair. She thought about the security briefing 6 weeks ago. She thought about Damien overruling 3 objections to bring Celeste into that room. "We need to have that conversation in person," she said. "Not on this line. I'm not exactly in a position to travel right now." "I know. Stay inside. Keep your men on the perimeter and keep your lights off, and do not, under any circumstances, allow anyone onto that property until I authorize it. Do you understand me?" Another pause. Longer this time. In 30 years of marriage, she had given him direct operational instructions exactly twice, and both times he had responded with the particular friction of a man who understood the instruction was correct but resented the source of it. She waited for that friction now. It didn't come. "Yes," he said. Just that. She ended the call and stood for a moment with the phone in her hand and the kitchen light too bright overhead and the distant sound of the sleeping granddaughter breathing in the other room, and she made herself breathe twice, slowly, before she turned back. Ferreira was watching the doorway. He had not pretended not to be. "Connecticut is contained," she said. "Solano's people are surveilling the property, but they haven't moved. My husband is secure for the moment." "For the moment," Castellano repeated from the couch. "It buys us time." She crossed back to the center of the room. "I need to reach out to the Reinhardt family. They were at the estate tonight, and I haven't been able to confirm their status." "Young Reinhardt got out early," Castellano said, "before the shooting started. He left about 10 minutes after your husband made his announcement." A pause waited with implication. "I noticed because I thought it was strange at the time." Vivian processed this. Heinrich Reinhardt, 29 years old, 3rd generation, had taken over from his father 18 months ago when the elder Reinhardt suffered a stroke that left him communicative but not operational. Heinrich was by most assessments still consolidating, still proving himself to the older members of his family's structure. He had left the party before the attack, 10 minutes after Damien's announcement, which meant either remarkable coincidence or remarkable foreknowledge. She did not say any of this aloud, not yet. She needed the information to develop further before she introduced it into a room that was already operating at maximum tension, because rooms at maximum tension had a tendency to make decisions at speed, and speed in this particular landscape was rarely an ally. "I'm going to need everyone here to try to rest," she said instead. "We have rooms on the upper 2 floors. My people will maintain perimeter watch through the night. In the morning, we'll have a clearer picture." Nobody argued. The granddaughters were already asleep. Castellano looked like a man who wanted to argue on principle, but didn't have the fuel for it. Ferreira simply nodded, the nod of a man who trusted the logistics because he had already decided to trust the person managing them. Vivian did not sleep. She sat in the kitchen through the early hours of the morning with her laptop open and her phone beside it and a legal pad she filled with a handwriting that got progressively tighter and smaller as the hours advanced, the handwriting of a mind compressing information into the smallest possible space because the space available was already crowded with things that needed to fit together in ways they were refusing to fit. At 2:17 in the morning, her intelligence contact in Hoboken called back. "I have her phone records," the woman said. There was something in her voice that Vivian had not heard from her before, not in 9 years. It took a moment to identify because it was not a quality she associated with this particular person, who was one of the most controlled individuals she had ever encountered. What she heard was disturbance, the sound of a woman who had found something she wished she hadn't. "Tell me," Vivian said. "The calls to Solano's network are there. 6 of them over the last 9 weeks, placed from a burner that routes back to a purchase made in cash at a cell store on Bleecker in early March. The calls average 4 minutes. Last one was 8 days ago." She was in direct contact with Solano. "Yes, but Vivian—" A pause. "That's not the part I think you need to hear first." Vivian set her pen down on the legal pad. "There's a secondary communication chain. Different number, different routing. This one goes back 14 months. Another pause. "It routes to a number registered to a shell company in Delaware. The shell company is held by a parent entity in the Cayman Islands. The parent entity, when you pull the full ownership chain, tell me where it ends." The woman on the other end took a breath. "It ends with a holding structure that Heinrich Reinhardt's father used to manage his private assets before the stroke. The structure was never dissolved. It's been actively used in the last 14 months under the authority of a limited power of attorney." The kitchen was very quiet. "Heinrich has been in contact with Celeste Vaughn for 14 months, Vivian said. "The communication pattern suggests coordination, not casual contact. They're talking on a schedule. Every 10 to 12 days, rarely longer. The content we can't access because it's encrypted end to end, but the pattern is deliberate." Vivian picked the pen back up. Not to write anything, just to have something in her hand. "Pull everything you can on the Reinhardt family's current financial positioning. I want to know if there's been any significant capital movement in the last 6 months, any new asset acquisitions, anything that would indicate they were expecting a significant shift in the landscape. That's going to take until morning. Then I'll hear from you in the morning." She ended the call and looked at what she had written on the legal pad. Names and lines and questions and amounts of time. She drew a new line connecting 2 names she had kept separate until now, and the line, once drawn, made the shape of the thing clear in a way that it hadn't been before. The way shapes in ambiguous images suddenly resolve into something obvious once you see them and cannot unsee them. Celeste had not been a careless woman who recorded a security briefing out of vanity and naivety. Or she had been that, partly. Vivian believed the original recording had been opportunistic, the instinct of a woman who wanted to understand the infrastructure she was being positioned to inherit. But somewhere between that recording and the attack on the estate, someone had identified Celeste as an asset. Someone had cultivated her. Someone had turned a vain and ambitious woman's curiosity into a weapon. That someone had been Heinrich Reinhardt, which meant tonight's attack was not simply Marco Solano settling old scores with the Moretti family. Solano was the mechanism. Heinrich was the architect. And the target, the real target, not the building, not the bodies, but the structural target, was the power vacuum that would result from eliminating or catastrophically delegitimizing the Moretti leadership at a moment when every major family in New York was assembled in one room. Heinrich Reinhardt, 29 years old and still consolidating, had attempted to solve his consolidation problem by destroying someone else's empire and stepping into the space it left behind. He had left the party 10 minutes after the announcement because he knew what was coming and had timed his departure accordingly. And he had used Celeste Vaughn to do it. A woman who had been so focused on becoming the queen of the Moretti Empire that she had not noticed herself being made into the means of its destruction. Vivian sat with this for a long time. Outside, the pre-dawn city was doing what it always did, indifferent and continuous, and somewhere across the river Damien was sitting in a dark house with 3 men and 4 vehicles full of Solano's soldiers watching his perimeter, and somewhere uptown in a building Vivian had never been to. Heinrich Reinhardt was either sleeping or not sleeping, and the shape of the evening was finally fully clear to her in a way that made her feel not triumphant, but exhausted, the specific exhaustion of a person who has been right about something terrible and finds no comfort in the rightness. She thought about what Ferreira had asked her. "What do you intend to do?" She had not answered him then. She had an answer now, but it was not the answer she would have given 24 hours ago. 24 hours ago, her intentions had been largely structural. Protect the network, maintain the peace, manage the inevitable dissolution of her marriage with the minimal collateral damage possible. 24 hours ago, she had been a woman operating in the margins of a power structure that did not officially acknowledge her existence. That woman, she understood, was no longer available. The margin had collapsed. The structure had been blown open. What remained was not a choice between visibility and invisibility, but a choice about what to do with the visibility she now had no option but to occupy. She was still sitting with that when the kitchen door opened and Marco came in. He had the look of a man who had not slept either, which she had expected, and the look of a man carrying something he needed to put down somewhere, which she had not. He poured himself a glass of water at the sink and drank half of it and set the glass down and looked at her across the kitchen with the expression of a man who has served one person faithfully for a very long time and is about to say something that exists outside the formal parameters of that service. "There's something you need to know," he said. "There's a great deal I need to know. Be specific." "About your husband." He set the glass down. "About why Reinhardt was there tonight. Not just what he wanted from the attack. Why he believed it would work. Why he believed that the families would fracture along lines that would benefit him rather than consolidate against the common threat." Vivian looked at him. He believed they'd fracture because he expected the attack to eliminate enough senior leadership that the consolidation would be forced. The vacuum would pull the smaller families toward the nearest available power center, which he'd positioned himself to be. "That's part of it." Marco looked at the glass on the counter. He also had information that suggested the Moretti family's internal structure was already compromised, that there were senior members of the family who were prepared to redirect their loyalty before the attack even happened, as an insurance policy, in exchange for positioning under a Reinhardt-led consolidation. The silence that followed was different from the other silences of the evening. It was the silence of something cold and specific. "Who?" Vivian said. Marco looked at her. In 38 years of service to the Moretti family, in 30 years of proximity to Vivian specifically, she had never heard him hesitate the way he hesitated now. The hesitation of a man navigating between loyalty to a person and loyalty to a truth that the person needed to have. "Reyes," he said, "and 2 of the senior capos, Donnelly and Park." She absorbed this. Reyes, Damien's most trusted personal security man, the one who had been with him in Connecticut tonight, the one currently standing on the perimeter of the dark house with a weapon and access to everything inside it. "How long have you known?" she asked. "I confirmed it 2 hours ago. I've had suspicions for 6 weeks, since the security briefing. Reyes was the one who told Don Damien to allow Ms. Vaughn into the room over the objections of the security staff. He framed it as a loyalty question, that excluding her would signal distrust. Don Damien accepted that framing. 6 weeks. Marco had carried this for 6 weeks, and she understood why. Because bringing unconfirmed suspicions about Damien's most trusted man to Damien himself was not an action that ended well for the person bringing them. And Marco was 63 years old and had survived this long by being precise about which hills were worth dying on. "Damien is in Connecticut with Reyes right now," she said. "Yes." She was already reaching for her phone. Marco's hand came out and stopped just short of her arm, not touching it, just present in the air between her hand and the phone. If you call Damien directly and warn him, Reyes will know the network has identified him. We lose the advantage and we lose the ability to contain what Reyes knows about Reinhardt's plan going forward. If I don't call Damien and Reyes decides tonight is the night to finish what the attack started, Reyes won't move tonight. Reinhardt's instruction was to wait. The attack was designed to force a power vacuum through public humiliation and leadership confusion, not through direct assassination. Assassination creates martyrs and it creates vendettas. Reinhardt is too precise for that. Reyes has orders to surveil and report, not to act. You sound very certain. I am not certain, Marco said, with the particular honesty of a man who had learned that certainty in this business was almost always a form of arrogance. But I believe it is the higher probability scenario. She looked at him. In 30 years, she had learned to read Marco's assessments with a high degree of confidence, not because he was infallible, but because he never represented his confidence as greater than it was. If he said he believed something was likely, it was likely. If he said he was certain, she paid attention to the distinction. What would you do? She asked, not because she intended to defer to him, because she valued the data point. I would call someone at the Connecticut property who is not Reyes, he said. Someone Reinhardt's people would not have thought to turn, because they would not have identified them as significant. Vivian thought. The Connecticut property had a full household staff, a cook, 2 groundskeepers, a housekeeper who had worked there for 11 years. None of them would have appeared in any of Reinhardt's strategic assessments because none of them carried weapons or held operational authority. They were invisible in exactly the way that Vivian herself had been invisible, and she understood what that invisibility could carry. She picked up her phone and called the housekeeper. The woman answered on the 3rd ring with the voice of someone who had been awake and waiting, which meant the activity at the property's perimeter had reached the interior of the house. In whatever form, visible fear traveled through buildings in the dark. Margaret, Vivian said, I need you to do something for me. I need you to walk through the house normally, the way you would if you were checking the rooms before bed. And I need you to count how many men are inside the building right now, where each one is, and what each one is doing. And I need you to tell me on this call, very casually, as if you're telling me about the weather. A pause. Then, of course, Mrs. Moretti, it's been a bit chilly up here. Let me just check on things. She heard footsteps. She heard the sound of a door. She heard another door. She heard Margaret's breathing, which was controlled with the determined regularity of a woman who understood that she had been asked to do something that required nerve and was supplying the nerve because 11 years of service had built the kind of trust that functions under pressure. 3 men in the front rooms, Margaret said, pleasantly, conversationally. Your husband is in the study on the 2nd floor with Mr. Reyes. The other 2 are in the kitchen. Damien alone in a room with Reyes. The 2 additional men, Reinhardt's people, she assumed, inserted into Damien's protection detail at some prior point through Reyes's coordination in the kitchen below. Thank you, Margaret, she said. Make sure the side door is unlocked before you go to bed. She ended the call and looked at Marco. I need 4 men at the Connecticut property inside 90 minutes. People Reinhardt's network won't have mapped, not regular security. I need people from the outer circles, maintenance staff, drivers, anyone who's been part of the household infrastructure without appearing in any strategic profile. Marco was already moving toward the door. I have 3. Find a 4th. I'll go myself. She looked at him. He was 63 years old and had not, to her knowledge, been in a physical altercation in over a decade, but he was standing in the kitchen doorway with the posture of a man who had made a decision and was not interested in revisiting it. Marco, don't, he said simply, and left. She sat back down at the kitchen table with the legal pad and the laptop and the phone and the cooling remains of a night that had started with broken champagne flutes and ended with the discovery that the people standing closest to her husband were the ones most interested in seeing him fail to survive it. She opened the laptop and began composing a message to an address that existed on a server in a country with no extradition agreements with the United States, because there was one more piece of this that she had not yet addressed, and that could not wait until morning, the piece that connected everything else. The financing. Heinrich Reinhardt was 29 years old and still consolidating, and running an operation of this complexity required capital, required operational infrastructure, required the kind of sustained investment that left traces even when the people making the investment were careful. She wanted those traces. She wanted them documented and verified and held somewhere that neither Reinhardt nor anyone connected to him could access or alter, because what she was building toward was not a confrontation in a dark room with men and weapons. What she was building toward was a reckoning of the kind that couldn't be undone, the kind that played out not in back corridors but in the open, in front of every family that had a stake in the stability she had spent 12 years quietly ensuring. She wanted the evidence complete and unassailable before she brought it into a room, because the kind of judgment she intended to call down on Heinrich Reinhardt required the kind of evidence that made denial not just wrong, but visibly, publicly, irrevocably absurd. She was halfway through the message when her phone rang again. The number on the screen made her stop entirely. It was not a number she had seen before, but the prefix was one she recognized. It was the routing code for a secure line she had set up 3 years ago for a specific contingency, a line she had given to exactly one person outside the network, a person she had hoped never to need. She answered. "Mrs. Moretti." The voice was male, flat, professional. "This is Special Agent Daniel Cho, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I apologize for the hour. I'm calling because we've been monitoring the Solano network for approximately 14 months. And what happened tonight at your estate falls within an investigation that is significantly further along than anyone in your husband's organization is aware of. I'd like to talk to you about what we both know and what we might be able to do with it." Vivian sat very still. The FBI had been watching. For 14 months, which was exactly the length of time that Heinrich Reinhardt had been in contact with Celeste Vaughn, which was not a coincidence, which meant that the federal investigation had originated not with Solano's network, but with something or someone connected to Reinhardt, and that whatever they had built in 14 months of surveillance was now intersecting with everything that had happened tonight in ways she needed to understand immediately and completely. She thought about the network, about 12 years of careful construction, about the safe houses and the tunnels and the humanitarian infrastructure she had built to protect people the system didn't protect, and about what a federal investigation of the surrounding landscape might do to an operation that had always depended on occupying the space between visibility and scrutiny. She thought about Reyes in a second-floor study with her husband and Marco driving north through the dark. She thought about Heinrich Reinhardt, wherever he was, believing the night had gone largely according to plan. And she made the decision that she understood, even as she made it, she could not unmake. The decision that would require her to become, fully and without reservation, the person the last 12 hours had been insisting she already was. The person she had been constructing in the margins of someone else's empire for 12 years without ever quite admitting to herself that the construction had always been for exactly this moment. "Agent Cho," she said, "I'm going to tell you something first, and then I'm going to decide how much of this conversation to continue. 12 years ago, I built a network that has documentation on every significant illegal financial transaction connected to the Reinhardt family's expansion over the last 8 years. Every coordination point between Marco Solano and Heinrich Reinhardt's operation, and the identity of every compromised individual currently embedded in the Moretti family's security structure. I have this documentation stored in 4 separate locations with automatic release protocols that activate on a 72-hour delay unless I personally reset them." She paused. "Now, tell me what you have, and we'll see whether this is a conversation worth having." The silence on the other end lasted 4 seconds. Then Agent Cho said something she had not expected him to say, something that rearranged the entire evening one final time in a way that left her sitting in the kitchen of a brownstone on Meridian Street with her hand tight on the phone and the legal pad in front of her suddenly insufficient for the shape of what she was now holding. "Mrs. Moretti," he said, "we have your husband on wire for 11 counts of federal racketeering. We've had him for 8 months. The reason I'm calling you tonight, instead of the morning his indictment was scheduled to be announced, is that someone inside my investigation leaked that schedule to Heinrich Reinhardt 3 weeks ago. And we believe tonight's attack was designed not just to destabilize the Moretti family, but to eliminate you specifically before you could become a problem for what Reinhardt is planning to build in the space your husband's prosecution was going to leave behind. She had been the target, not Damien, not the assembled Dons, her network, her infrastructure. The one thing Heinrich Reinhardt could not absorb or redirect or co-opt if she was still alive and operational. She was the target, and she had walked through the attack and survived it. And now she was sitting in a kitchen with 12 years of documentation and a federal agent on the phone, and the full shape of it finally, completely, terribly visible. And there was no version of the next 24 hours that did not require her to burn down everything she had ever built in the old way in order to build it again in the only way that had any chance of surviving what was coming. She gave Agent Cho 40 minutes, not because she trusted him. Trust was not a variable she was operating with at this hour, in this kitchen, with this particular configuration of catastrophe arranged around her. She gave him 40 minutes because the information he carried was the one piece of the architecture she had not been able to build herself, the federal layer, the documented surveillance that existed outside any system Heinrich Reinhardt could reach and suppress. And because 40 minutes was enough time to understand whether Daniel Cho was what he said he was, or whether this call was one more layer of the same operation that had tried to kill her 6 hours ago. She spent the first 10 minutes asking him questions he could not have anticipated and watching how he answered them. Not the content of the answers, the texture. Whether he hesitated in the places a genuine investigator would hesitate. Whether he reached for information at the speed of someone retrieving it from memory rather than constructing it in real time. Whether the gaps in what he knew corresponded to the gaps she would expect given the angle of the investigation he described. He passed, not perfectly. There were 2 questions where she heard the particular friction of a man managing what he was authorized to disclose versus what he actually knew, which told her the investigation was larger than what he was showing her, which was itself useful information. But he passed well enough that she shifted from assessment to negotiation, which was a different kind of conversation entirely. The indictment timeline, she said. How firm is the morning announcement? It was firm until tonight. Now we have a complication. The leak inside your investigation. If we proceed on schedule, whoever fed Reinhardt the timeline will know we haven't identified them. They'll stay embedded. If we delay, we lose the element of surprise on the Solano arrests and give Reinhardt's people time to restructure. You need the leak identified before morning. We need it identified in the next 4 hours. She thought about this. She thought about 14 months of surveillance intersecting with 12 years of network intelligence, and about the particular shape of the information each of them held, and about how the combination of those 2 bodies of information created something neither of them could build alone. She thought about what she was being asked to trade, and what she was being offered in return, and whether the offer was real. The network, she said. My humanitarian operation, the safe houses, the evacuation infrastructure, the personnel. If I cooperate fully with your investigation, if I give you documented access to everything I have on Reinhardt and Solano, I need a specific guarantee about how the network is handled. I can't make guarantees about ongoing illegal. The network has never conducted an illegal operation, she said, and she said it with the particular flatness of a statement that was both true and incomplete, and that she was prepared to defend in any venue. It is a private humanitarian organization that operates in proximity to illegal activity because the people it protects are often in proximity to illegal activity. The organization itself has no criminal predicate. What I need from you is a formal agreement that the investigation's focus remains on Reinhardt, Solano, and the compromised Moretti structure, and that my network is treated as a protected witness resource rather than a target. A long pause. She could hear him breathing, the sound of a man running calculations. I need to make a call, he said. You have 20 minutes. She used those 20 minutes to call Marco. He answered on the first ring, which meant he was awake and moving and already somewhere near Connecticut, which meant the next phase of the Connecticut situation was closer than she'd estimated. She gave him the update in 9 sentences, stripped to essentials, because Marco had never needed more than essentials, and the situation had moved past the point where context was a luxury. Cho's people will want to move on Reyes simultaneously with the summit, she said. That means we need Damien physically separated from Reyes before dawn. Not confrontationally. Reyes cannot know he's been identified until Cho's people are in position. I can do that, Marco said. There's a reason for Damien to step out. The groundskeeper found something in the east garden earlier tonight, damage from the perimeter surveillance vehicles. I can have him come look at it. At 4 in the morning. Damien hasn't slept. He's been pacing since he got there. He'll come. Take him to the garage. Keep him there until I tell you otherwise. She paused. Marco, when this is over, don't, he said. The same word he'd used in the kitchen. Same tone, same finality. She let it go. Call me when he's clear of Reyes. She sat with the phone in her hand in the kitchen silence and thought about what came next, which was the part she had been moving toward for the last several hours, without letting herself fully articulate it, because articulating it made it real, and real meant committed, and she had not been ready to be fully committed until this moment. She was ready now. The readiness felt less like courage than like the absence of any remaining alternative, which she had come to understand was often what courage actually was. Cho called back in 17 minutes. We have an agreement in principle. My supervisor wants it formalized in writing before any joint operation proceeds. We can do that at the field office at 6 a.m. We can do it at a location I specify at 5:30, she said. I'm not walking into a federal building before I know your leak is contained. Another pause. Fair, he said, and she heard genuine respect in the word, the respect of a professional encountering another professional operating at equivalent precision. Send me the location. She sent it. Then she opened the laptop and spent the next 90 minutes doing the thing she had been building toward all night, compiling the documentation. Not selecting pieces of it, not curating a presentation, all of it. Every verified transaction record and communication log and safehouse manifest and personnel file that the network had assembled over 12 years, organized into a structure that a federal prosecutor could read and use and build from. The entire architecture of what she had built laid out in the open for the first time in its existence. It was not a comfortable thing to do. It felt, in some ways, like dissection, like opening something living and necessary and exposing its interior to light that might kill it even as it preserved it. But she understood that the version of the network that had survived by being invisible was already gone, had been gone since the moment Ferreira looked at her in that ruined ballroom and said, "Your network," because once the thing was named by someone outside it, it was no longer invisible. And an organization that is no longer invisible but is still trying to operate as though it is becomes something far more fragile than one that has chosen the terms of its own exposure. She was choosing the terms. At 4:47 in the morning, Marco called. He's in the garage. Reyes is in the study. He thinks Damien is walking the perimeter. How long can you hold him there? As long as it takes. Vivian, he's not in good shape. He wants to talk to you. Tell him I'll be there in 2 hours. She was not going to Connecticut. She needed Damien to believe she was coming because a man who believes help is arriving stays in place, and she needed him to stay in place. She was not proud of this. She filed it with the other things she was not proud of and would deal with later, in the part of the future that was still theoretical. At 5:15, she woke Ferreira. She did not wake Castellano yet. What she needed from Ferreira was different from what she needed from Castellano, and she needed it first. The old man was awake before she finished knocking, which suggested he had not been fully asleep, which did not surprise her. She brought him coffee she'd made in the kitchen, real coffee, black, no ceremony, and sat across from him in the room's single chair while he sat on the edge of the bed with his granddaughters still sleeping behind him, and she told him everything. Not a summary. Everything. Heinrich Reinhardt, Celeste and the 14 months of contact, Reyes and Donnelly and Park, the federal investigation and Damien's indictment, the leak inside Cho's team, the documentation she had compiled through the night, the agreement she had negotiated with the FBI in the last 2 hours. Ferreira listened with his coffee cup held in both hands and his eyes on her face and his expression doing nothing visible, the expression of a man who had heard terrible things before and had learned that his face's reaction to them was a form of information he was not obligated to share. He let her finish completely before he spoke. You negotiated a federal cooperation agreement, he said, tonight, while managing the evacuation of 12 families, the Connecticut situation, and the Reinhardt intelligence. There wasn't a better time. Something moved in his face that might have been the very distant ancestor of a smile. "No," he agreed. "There probably wasn't." He drank from the coffee. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to call an emergency summit. Every Don who is at the estate tonight, plus Reinhardt. I need them all in one room by 9 a.m. I need it called under your authority, not mine, because a summons from Paulo Ferreira is the only summons that every family will respond to without negotiation or delay. You want Reinhardt in the room. I want Reinhardt in the room before he understands what this morning is going to look like. If he gets the call from you at 5:30 a.m., he'll come because refusing a Ferreira summons after a night like this would be the single most suspicious thing he could do, and he's too careful to be that suspicious." Ferreira looked at her steadily. "And when he's in the room? When he's in the room, I'll have everything else in place. Cho's team makes their moves simultaneously. Solano's network, the compromised Moretti personnel, the Reinhardt financial documentation filed with the federal court. All of it happens while we're all in the same room so that no one can coordinate a response before it's already done." The old man set his coffee down. He folded his hands in his lap and looked at them for a moment and then looked back up at her. "You're going to burn your husband's empire down in front of every family he ever led." "My husband's empire is already burning," she said. "I'm deciding what gets built from the ash." Ferreira picked up his phone. The calls went out at 5:23. Vivian listened to Ferreira's side of each one from the doorway. His voice, at 81, still carrying the particular gravity of authority so long established it no longer needed to assert itself, simply existed, and every Don on the other end of those calls heard it and responded to it the way men always respond to authority they have internalized over decades. "Yes, we'll be there. What location?" When he reached Heinrich Reinhardt, Vivian held herself very still. Reinhardt's voice on the speakerphone was careful and controlled, and exactly 23 seconds slower to respond to the summons than any of the other Dons had been. A gap small enough that most people would not notice it, large enough that Vivian noticed it and understood what it meant. He was calculating, running the angles, determining whether compliance or refusal served him better. 23 seconds was how long it took a man who had spent the night believing his operation had succeeded to determine that showing up was still safer than the alternative. "Of course, Don Ferreira," he said. "Where and when?" She had the location set up by 6:15, a private event space in Midtown that the network had used for coordinating meetings between conflicting family interests on 3 previous occasions. Neutral ground, verified clean, with enough separate access points that arrivals could be staggered, and no single family's security personnel would have sight lines on all the others. She had 3 of her network coordinators there by 6, managing the space with the efficiency of people who had done this before, setting chairs, confirming sight lines, placing water at each position, not out of hospitality, but because people think more clearly when they're not physically uncomfortable, and she needed everyone in that room thinking clearly for what was about to happen. Agent Cho arrived at the location at 5:50, with 2 other agents and a woman introduced as the assistant U.S. attorney overseeing the Solano investigation. The attorney's name was Webb, and she had the contained energy of someone who had been managing a major federal prosecution for over a year and was now in the terminal hours of it, and was running entirely on the specific fuel of a person who is very close to something they have worked very hard toward. She shook Vivian's hand with a grip that was deliberate and looked at her with eyes that were assessing and direct and did not perform deference she didn't feel. Vivian liked her immediately. The written agreement took 40 minutes to finalize with Vivian's phone counsel, a lawyer in Chicago who took calls at any hour for clients who paid for that availability, present via audio the entire time. What emerged was not a formal immunity agreement, because the network's activities did not generate a criminal exposure that required immunity, but a memorandum of understanding that established the network's status as a protected cooperating resource, ring-fenced its personnel and infrastructure from investigative scrutiny, and committed the U.S. Attorney's Office to a public characterization of the organization's role in tonight's events that reflected its humanitarian function rather than its proximity to organized crime. It was not everything she wanted. It was what was achievable at 6 in the morning with a federal attorney who had her own constraints and a case she needed to protect. Vivian signed it with the understanding that the first version of any agreement is the beginning of a negotiation, not the end of one, and that what she was building toward in the months after this morning would give her considerably more leverage than she had right now. She signed it at 6:49. At 7:15, Marco called from Connecticut. His voice was clipped, and she heard something in the background that she identified after a half second as the sound of men moving fast in a confined space. Cho's people are on site. Reyes is in custody. Donnelly and Park are being picked up simultaneously. I'm getting confirmation on Park now. A pause. Damien he's asking questions I don't have answers for. Put him on. A shuffling sound. Then Damien's voice, and it was nothing like the voice from the phone call hours ago. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by something harder and more volatile. The voice of a man who has had his house entered by federal agents and is not yet understanding the full architecture of what is happening to him. "What did you do?" he said. Not a question. An accusation. "I kept you alive tonight," she said. "Reyes was going to move on you before morning, not on Reinhardt's orders, on his own initiative, because the federal indictment schedule leaked and Reyes decided a dead Don is cleaner than an arrested one when it comes to protecting the network he'd been building with Reinhardt." Silence. "The indictment," Damien said. 8 months of federal wire surveillance, 11 counts. Your attorney will need to start making calls by 8 a.m. if you want any procedural advantage. She paused. "Damien, I need you to listen to me very carefully. There is going to be a summit in approximately 90 minutes. Every family that was at the estate last night will be present, plus Heinrich Reinhardt, who organized the attack and used Celeste to do it. You are not going to be at this summit. I am the head of... You are under federal indictment and your most trusted security man was just arrested in your living room," she said, and she kept her voice exactly level, not cruel, not cold, just precise. The voice of a person delivering information that the recipient needs to process accurately. "Your presence at this summit would compromise everything I am trying to do this morning to protect what remains of this family's standing. I need you to stay in Connecticut with the federal agents who are currently in your house, cooperate with their processing, and let me handle the next 4 hours." The silence that followed was the longest of the night. She could hear him breathing, the specific quality of a man dismantling something internal and not wanting to be heard doing it. "And Celeste," he said finally. She thought about how to answer that. She thought about a woman in cobalt blue who had walked into the Moretti estate on Damien's arm and into a situation she had not fully understood, cultivated by a man who had identified her ambition and her access and had built a weapon out of both without her entirely knowing it. "She's not your problem right now," Vivian said. "I'll deal with it." She ended the call and turned back to the room where Cho and Webb and her network coordinators were completing the final staging for the morning, and she looked at the chairs arranged in a circle. No head of the table, deliberate, her instruction, and at the water glasses and the door and the particular quality of early light coming through the high windows, and she felt the weight of the night fully for the first time. Felt it in her lower back and behind her eyes, and in the tight place between her shoulder blades where tension had been living for hours, and she breathed through it because she could not put it down yet, was not close enough to done. At 8:40, the dawns began arriving. Ferreira first, because it was his summons and his presence set the room's tone. Castellano with fresh stitches above his eye and the look of a man who had slept 2 hours and made them count. The others in sequence, faces she knew, faces she had read across dinner tables and in hospital waiting rooms, and in the particular low-light venues where the infrastructure of this world conducted its real business. Each of them looked at her when they entered, not at the chair she was sitting in, not at the room's configuration, at her directly, the way people look at the person who is clearly running something even before the thing is officially begun. Heinrich Reinhardt arrived at 8:57. He was 29 years old, and he was dressed for a business meeting, and he entered the room with the particular composure of a man who had decided on his presentation and intended to hold it. He was taller than she had expected from photographs. 6'1", broad, with a face that was younger than his comportment, the face of a man who had spent years working to be taken more seriously than his age invited. He scanned the room with the practiced speed of someone trained to read configurations, and his scan paused for a fraction of a second when it reached Vivian, seated at the circle's edge rather than its center, and she watched him recalibrate in real time, watched the small adjustment behind his eyes as he revised his expectation of what this room was going to be. He found his seat. He nodded to Ferreira. He placed his hands flat on the table in front of him, and his face did something smooth and neutral and entirely constructed. "Don Ferreira," he said, "I'm glad everyone is safe after last night. It was an appalling thing." Ferreira looked at him for a moment with the mild eyes of an 81-year-old man who has heard people say appalling things were appalling for 60 years and has developed a finely calibrated sense for when the statement is sincere. He said nothing. Vivian looked at her phone. The text from Cho read, "Solano arrest complete. Financial filings submitted to court 7 minutes ago. Ready on your signal." She put the phone face down on the table. "I'd like to start," she said, and her voice carried in the room the way she had calibrated it to carry. Not loud, not projected, simply present enough that it occupied the space completely. "I want to thank everyone for coming on short notice after a very difficult night. What I'm going to share with you this morning is going to require you to hold your response until I've finished, because the picture is complete and it needs to be received as a whole." She looked around the circle. She let her eyes move to Reinhardt last. "Heinrich, I want you to know before I begin that you're welcome to leave at any point, but I think you'll find it more useful to stay." Something shifted in his face. The first crack in the smooth surface, small and quickly controlled, but there. She began. She laid it out in the order she had spent the last 3 hours organizing it in her mind, moving from the documented to the inferred to the verified, building the architecture the way she had built everything, incrementally, precisely, with the patience of someone who understood that the way a case is presented determines whether it can be refuted, and she had built this one to be irrefutable. The contact between Reinhardt and Celeste, the security briefing and the recording, the Solano coordination, the 3 compromised Moretti personnel, the federal wire surveillance, the financial documentation of 14 months of operational investment in a takeover strategy. She placed printed documents on the table as she spoke. Not many, 8 pages total, because she had learned that the right 8 pages were more persuasive than 80, and that men who are accustomed to having things demonstrated to them with minimal documentation tend to trust minimal documentation more than they trust volume. No one spoke. No one looked away. Even Castellano, who had known pieces of this since the safe house, was listening with the concentrated attention of someone hearing the whole for the first time and understanding that the whole was considerably more than the sum of what he already knew. Reinhardt sat very still. His hands were still flat on the table. His face had moved through 3 distinct phases since she started speaking: the composed neutrality of arrival, then a brief compression around the jaw that indicated the first real arrival of concern, then something that settled into stillness of a different quality, the stillness of a man who has run his calculations and arrived at a number he does not like. She finished. The room was quiet. Ferreira looked at Reinhardt. "Well," he said. Reinhardt looked at the documents on the table. He looked at the faces around the circle. He looked at Vivian. And in looking at Vivian, he made the first genuine mistake she had seen him make all morning, which was that his eyes, for just a second, went to the door. Not a physical movement, just a look. The instinctive glance of an animal locating exits, and every man in the room saw it. "I'd like to consult with my counsel before," he began. "Your counsel is currently with federal agents who are reviewing 14 months of financial documentation," Vivian said. "You're welcome to call him. His phone will go to voicemail." Reinhardt's hands came off the table, just slightly. The first physical tell of the morning, the body communicating what the face was refusing to. Castellano leaned forward. The stitches above his eye were dark against his skin, and his voice had the particular weight of a man speaking about the specific cost of something. "I lost 2 men last night," he said. "Men with families. Men who worked for me for 20 years. He paused. "I want to hear you deny it." The room waited. Heinrich Reinhardt looked at the circle of men who had built and sustained and bled for the world he had tried to take. and he looked at the woman who had spent the night dismantling everything he had built toward. And something in his face made the final transition from composure to something rawer and more honest. The face of a man who is lost and knows it and is deciding what version of himself to be in the losing. He opened his mouth. The door opened first. Not from the outside, from the interior corridor, and it was not Agent Cho's people. Not yet. It was Celeste Vaughn, and she was not supposed to be here. And the fact that she was here meant something had gone wrong with the containment at the Connecticut property, and Vivian was on her feet before the door had finished opening, but she was not fast enough to stop what happened next, which was that Celeste walked into the room with the look of a woman who had driven 3 hours and made a decision somewhere on the highway and was not going to be talked out of it. And she looked at the circle of faces and at Heinrich Reinhardt's face specifically, and she said, in a voice that was completely steady, in the way that voices are sometimes steady when a person has gone beyond the point where trembling is available to them, I recorded the briefing. I know what I did, and I know who told me to do it. She placed a phone on the table. On the screen was a text chain 14 months long, and every eye in the room moved from the phone to Heinrich Reinhardt, and the room held its breath, and Vivian stood with her hands at her sides and her heart hitting hard against her ribs, because this was the moment she had not planned for, the variable she had not controlled, and it was either going to break everything open or break everything apart, and she did not yet know which. The phone on the table did not move. Neither did anyone in the room. Celeste Vaughn stood in the doorway with her coat still on and her eyes fixed on Heinrich Reinhardt, and the text chain glowing on that screen was 14 months long, and every person seated around the circle understood, without needing to read a single word of it, exactly what 14 months of documented contact between those two people meant in the context of everything that had been laid out in the last 40 minutes. Reinhardt looked at the phone. He looked at Celeste. He did not look at anyone else, which was itself the answer to every question that remained, because a man with an innocent explanation looks at the room seeking witnesses, and a man without one looks only at the evidence and the person holding it. Vivian watched his face complete its final transition. She had seen it moving through stages all morning, the composed arrival, the controlled neutrality, the hairline fracture when she began presenting the documentation, the deeper crack when Cho's name entered the room. What she saw now was not collapse. It was something quieter and in some ways more final than collapse. The moment when a person stops managing their face entirely because the energy required for the management has been redirected towards something more urgent, the internal calculation of what is salvageable from the wreckage of an operation that has just failed completely in front of the people it was designed to replace. He was 29 years old. She had known that before this morning. She felt the reality of it differently now, looking at him. Not with sympathy. She was not capable of sympathy for him yet, and perhaps would not be for a long time, but with the particular recognition of someone who has watched ambition outrun judgment before and knows the specific expression on the face of the moment the gap becomes undeniable. "Celeste," he said. His voice was still controlled, still inhabiting the register of a man who believed control was available to him. "Whatever you think that proves—" "I recorded it," Celeste said. "All of it. Not just the texts, the calls." Her hand moved to the phone, and she pressed play, and Reinhardt's voice came out of the small speaker, tinny and compressed but recognizable, speaking a sentence that Vivian did not need to hear fully to understand because the first 7 words were sufficient. "The security briefing is happening Tuesday. I need you to—" Reinhardt's hand moved toward the phone. Marco's hand got there first. He was 63 years old, and he moved with the economy of someone who had learned long ago that speed in confined spaces is not about force, but about position. And his position relative to the phone was better than Reinhardt's by 2 feet, and he covered the distance before the younger man's arm had fully extended. And he placed his hand flat over the phone on the table and looked at Reinhardt with the mild, patient expression of a man who has made a decision and is not interested in revisiting it. Reinhardt stopped. The room held its breath. Then Reinhardt sat back in his chair, and his hands went to his thighs, and he looked at the ceiling for exactly 3 seconds. And when he looked back down, his face had done the thing Vivian had been waiting for it to do since he walked in. It had gone honest. Not remorseful, not broken, but honest, the specific honesty of a man who has run out of performance and is left with only what he actually is, which was, she now understood, considerably less than what he had believed himself to be. "I want to speak to my attorney," he said. "Your attorney is currently in a federal building on Center Street," Vivian said. "He received a call 37 minutes ago from Agent Cho's office regarding the financial filings that were submitted to the court this morning. He is aware of the general situation. He is not currently available to take your call, but he will be within the hour." She paused. "You're welcome to wait." Reinhardt looked at her for a long moment. The look contained many things: anger and assessment, and the residue of a plan that had consumed 14 months of his life, and the specific bitterness of someone who is lost to a person they underestimated. She recognized that last part because she had seen it before, from men who had made the same error, and it always looked the same. The particular affront of discovering that the person you didn't think you needed to account for was the one who undid you. "You built all of this," he said. Not a question. His voice had dropped to something conversational, almost quiet, the voice of a man processing aloud. "The network, the documentation, the federal relationship, while being—" He stopped. "While being what?" she said. He looked at the table. "Invisible," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "That's how it works." The door opened and Agent Cho came in with 2 agents, and the formal register of federal process settled over the room like a change in atmospheric pressure, that specific quality of legal authority that reorganizes the physical space it enters. Reinhardt stood when asked. He moved with the agents toward the door. At the threshold he paused and turned back, and the look he gave Vivian was the last look. Not threatening, not pleading, just the final information gathering of a man who was already beginning to think about what came next and wanted to fix accurately in his memory the shape of what had ended him. She held his gaze until the door closed. The room exhaled. Castellano pressed both hands on the table and pushed himself upright, and the sound his joints made was the sound of a man who had not slept and was not going to pretend otherwise. Ferreira had not moved from his chair and did not move now, but something in his posture had changed. The sustained vigilance of the morning releasing itself in the small ways that bodies release things when they are finally permitted to, the almost imperceptible settling of shoulders that have been held too precisely for too long. The other dons around the table were doing what people do when sustained crisis resolves: small physical adjustments, breath release slowly, the social recalibration of men who have witnessed something they will be processing privately for months. They looked at Vivian with expressions that shared a common quality, something she could not immediately name but recognized when she sat with it. It was the look of people revising a long-held assumption and finding the revision not comfortable but necessary. Celeste was still standing near the door. She had not moved since Reinhardt left. She was looking at the floor with the expression of someone who has done the thing they came to do and is now standing in the aftermath of it, in the specific quiet that follows a significant action when the adrenaline has finished its work, and what remains is just the person and what they have chosen, and the weight of both. Vivian crossed the room to her slowly. She let the distance close at a pace that gave Celeste time to see her coming and make whatever internal adjustment she needed to before Vivian arrived. When she was close enough that the conversation was private, she stopped. "You drove from Connecticut," Vivian said. 3 hours. Celeste looked up. Her eyes were dry, red at the edges. The eyes of someone who had been crying earlier and had stopped and was holding the stopped crying carefully, like something that might resume, if not managed. "I didn't call first because I thought if I called first you'd tell me not to come." "I would have," Vivian said. "I know." A pause. "I needed to do it in person. In front of them." She glanced toward the table where the dons were beginning to collect their things, the morning's formal business concluded. They deserved to hear it in person. Vivian looked at her for a moment. She thought about the cobalt dress and the hand on Damien's forearm in the ballroom and the vision of this woman she had assembled over 9 days of research, the brother with the debt, the apartment in the West 60s, the colorist in Tribeca. The ambition that Reinhardt had identified and calibrated and aimed with the precision of a man who understood that other people's hunger could be redirected toward his own ends if you fed it carefully enough and from the right angle. He chose you specifically, Vivian said, not randomly. He identified you because of your access to Damien and because of what you wanted. He gave you what you wanted while he used what you had. That's what this was. Celeste's jaw tightened. I know that. I'm not saying it to diminish your responsibility. I'm saying it because it's the accurate version of what happened, and you're going to be living with your own version of this for a long time, and the accurate version is the only one that will actually hold up. Something shifted in Celeste's face. A small movement, the movement of something painful being received rather than deflected. There were children, she said, for the second time. The words had the quality of something she had been repeating to herself in the car for 3 hours. A sentence that kept returning because it had not yet been absorbed into anything, was still just sitting on the surface of her, raw and unprocessed. The children are safe, Vivian said. That is also accurate, and I need you to hold both things. Celeste looked at her with the directness of someone who has nothing left to protect. Why are you... She stopped, started again. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? I don't know. Something colder. A pause. After everything. Cold is easy, Vivian said. It doesn't require anything. What comes next requires considerably more than cold. She left Celeste with Webb's card and the instruction to call her attorney before she spoke to anyone else from the federal team, and she went back to the table where Ferreira was still seated and waiting with the patience of a man who understood that some conversations happen only when the room has cleared enough to hold them properly. The other Dons had dispersed into the corridor and the adjacent rooms, collecting their things, making their calls, beginning the process of returning to their own operations in the aftermath of a night that had altered the landscape they were all operating in. She could hear Castellano's voice in the hallway, low and specific, the voice of a man giving instructions. She could hear the agent processing paperwork in the side room. She sat down across from Ferreira, and he looked at her with the mild eyes that she had spent the morning learning to read as something other than mild. My granddaughters asked about you this morning, he said. The younger one wanted to know who the woman in the red dress was, the one who knew where to go. She said nothing. I told her you were someone who had been paying attention for a very long time. He paused. She said that was a good answer. He folded his hands in his lap. I have been paying attention for a very long time myself, Vivian, since before you married Damien Moretti. I knew your father. This was not information she had possessed. She felt the arrival of it in the particular way that significant surprises arrive when you are already saturated with the events of a long night, not as shock, but as a quiet expansion, the sense of a picture adding one more detail that changes the scale of what you were looking at. My father left this world when I was 19, she said carefully. I know when he left it. I know why. Ferreira's voice was measured. Your father built something similar to what you have built. Smaller, earlier. He called it a different thing. He operated it for 6 years before the people who found it useful decided they needed it to serve different ends than the ones he'd built it for. And when he refused to redirect it, they removed him from it. He looked at her steadily. I was one of the people who found it useful. I was not one of the people who decided to remove him, but I did not stop them, and I have carried that for 32 years. The kitchen sounds from the adjacent room, distant traffic through the walls. Vivian looked at Paulo Ferreira and understood that she was receiving something that had been held in reserve for a very long time, offered now in this particular morning because this particular morning was the first one in 32 years that had created a context where the offering made sense. You're telling me this now, she said. I'm telling you this now because what you have built is larger than what your father built and is more carefully constructed and has survived a night that would have ended a less well-built thing. And I want you to go forward understanding that what you are doing has history behind it. He paused. And because I want you to know that the mistake that was made 32 years ago will not be made again. Not by me. Not by the men who were in this room today. She sat with this for a long moment. She thought about her father. Not the man she had lost at 19, but the man she had never fully known. The man who had been building something in the margins of a world that didn't acknowledge him. The man from whom she had received one lesson about how to survive and had not until this moment understood that the lesson was also a continuation. The council, she said. Yes, Ferreira said. The council. 2 weeks, she said. I need 2 weeks to handle the immediate matters. Then we sit down and build it properly. He nodded. Then, with the same deliberate care with which he had done everything this morning, he reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and removed something small and set it on the table between them. It was a ring. A signet ring, old gold, the kind of object that carries institutional weight in the world they both inhabited, the kind that is removed from a finger only in the most significant of circumstances. He did not push it toward her. He simply placed it on the table and left it there. My father's, he said. He gave it to me when I took responsibility for the family. I've been carrying it as a secondary piece for 15 years because my arthritis won't allow me to wear it. He looked at it on the table. It means what I intend it to mean, and nothing more. She looked at the ring. She did not pick it up. I'm not a Don. No, he agreed. You're something we don't have a word for yet. We'll find one. He stood, slowly, with the careful construction of a man who has been managing physical limitation for long enough that the management has become part of his movement. 2 weeks, then. He left. She sat alone at the table with the ring and the documents and the water glasses and the morning light through the high windows, and she looked at the ring for a long time without touching it, because some things need to be looked at before they are picked up, need to be understood in the looking before they are held. She picked it up. She drove to Connecticut in the late afternoon in a car Marco had arranged, the city releasing her to the highway with the particular indifference of a place that does not pause for individual departures, regardless of what those individuals are carrying. She watched the buildings give way to the wider sky of the outer sprawl, and thought about nothing deliberate, which was itself a kind of deliberateness, the choice to let the mind move where it wanted after hours of directing it precisely. Damien was in the kitchen. He was sitting at the table in the clothes from the anniversary party, the charcoal suit that had been tailored recently for a version of the evening that had not occurred, and he was holding a coffee cup that had gone cold, and he was looking at nothing in particular with the expression of a man who has spent several hours in the company of federal agents being processed, and is now in the specific depletion that follows the forced articulation of things one has been not quite knowing for a long time. He looked at her when she came through the door. He looked at her the way you look at a person you have known for 20 years when you are seeing them clearly for the first time, which is a different kind of looking than recognition, is something that sits uncomfortably between recognition and strangeness. The disorientation of realizing that familiar and known are not the same thing. She sat down across from him. She put her keys on the table. She looked at him. Reyes, he said, in federal custody. He was with me for 17 years. I know. He was quiet for a moment. His thumb moved on the handle of the coffee cup, the small habitual motion of a man working through something he hasn't finished working through. How long did you know about him? I confirmed it last night. I had a developing suspicion for approximately 6 weeks. 6 weeks? He repeated it not as an accusation, but as something he was holding up to examine. And you didn't tell me. I had no confirmed evidence and no mechanism to bring the suspicion to you that wouldn't have telegraphed the concern to Reyes himself. If he knew he'd been identified before I had the federal cooperation in place, he would have moved earlier, on Connecticut, on you. Damien looked at the table. Something moved through his face that she watched without trying to read too precisely, because some of what a person experiences in moments like this belongs to them and not to the observer. You protected me, he said. Last night. This morning. I protected what could be protected. That includes me. She paused. Yes. He nodded slowly. The nod of a man receiving information that will take longer to integrate than the immediate moment allows, but who is no longer, at least, refusing the information. He looked up at her. The indictment. Your attorney has the details. The cooperation framework is the path forward. What you know about Reinhardt's operation and the Solano network represents significant value to the federal case. Webb is not unsympathetic to people who make her prosecution stronger. She paused. You'll need to be honest with her. Completely. About everything, not just what you think they already know, because they know more than you think they know, and anything you manage rather than disclose becomes a liability. He was quiet for a long moment. The family, the legitimate holdings. I've already begun the separation. The real estate portfolio and the three legitimate business interests can be structurally insulated from the criminal exposure with proper filing. It won't be complete insulation, but it will be defensible. Your attorney and I will need to coordinate on the sequencing. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted into the territory of what she recognized from very early in their marriage, from the years before the weight of his own authority had calcified whatever was underneath it. Something direct and without the performance of strength. Something that was simply the man, unmanaged. "Why are you doing this?" he said. "After everything, why are you—" "Because the family is not just you," she said. "The people who work for this organization, the legitimate staff, the households, the people who have built their lives inside this structure. They didn't make the decisions that created tonight's situation, and they shouldn't lose everything because of those decisions. I'm protecting them." She looked at him steadily. "And because you are still the father of my son, and I would like him to have something to come home to that isn't entirely wreckage, that's why." Damien looked at her for a long time. His jaw worked. He looked away at the window where the Connecticut afternoon was doing its late golden thing, indifferent and beautiful. When he looked back, his eyes were doing something she had not seen from them in a very long time, and she was not going to name it because naming it would make it into something that needed a response. And she was not capable of the right response tonight. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to know that I'm not asking to change anything. I'm asking because I need to understand it." She waited. "The announcement last night, the way I did it." He stopped. "I need to know if you knew it was coming." "I suspected something was coming, not that specifically." "Were you—" He stopped again. The words seemed to cost him something. "Were you hurt?" She looked at him across the kitchen table in the afternoon light, and she thought about what honest looked like at this particular distance and from this particular vantage point, after this particular night. "Yes," she said. "Not the way I would have been years ago, but yes." He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the direct quality was still there, and he did not look away. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the announcement, for the way it was done, for the 20 years that made that announcement make sense to me as something I could do in that room to you." He paused. "I know an apology is not the appropriate scale for this." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She paused. "But I received it." She stayed 3 hours. She worked through the legal separation of the legitimate holdings from the kitchen table while Damien met with his attorney in the study, and she made calls, and she sent documents, and she did the detailed, unglamorous work that the next months would require the first iteration of. And when she was finished for the day, she gathered her things and she stood at the kitchen door, and Damien was back at the table with his cold coffee, and he looked at her one more time. "Where will you go?" he asked. "I have somewhere," she said. "The brownstone." She looked at him. He had not known about the brownstone. He should not have been able to name it. "How do you know about that?" Something moved in his face, not guilt, something more complicated, the expression of a man making a decision about how honest to be. "I've known about it for 3 years," he said. "I didn't know what it was for. I knew it existed. I had someone trace a property connection in the shell company structure, and it came back to something I knew was yours." He paused. "I didn't investigate further." She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him and understood that this was the last piece of the picture. The detail she hadn't possessed, the information that reframed the last 3 years of their marriage into a slightly different shape. A shape in which he had known something existed, had chosen not to know what it was, had built a wall around that not knowing and maintained it for 3 years. She didn't know yet what to make of that. She filed it with the other things that would need longer than tonight. "Lock the side door before you go to bed," she said. "The federal team will have someone on the perimeter through the night." She drove back to the city. The brownstone on Meridian Street was empty and dim when she came in, and she moved through it without turning lights on until she reached the kitchen, where she turned on one light over the counter and stood for a moment with her hands flat on the surface and the city audible through the walls and the legal pad with its compressed handwriting still on the table. She was 51 years old and she had not slept, and she was tired in a way that went deeper than the body, the tiredness of someone who has held something very large for a very long time and has been required in the last 20 hours to hold it in an entirely new way. The kind of tired that does not resolve with sleep, but with time, with the slow work of letting the shape of what has changed become familiar. She went to the sink and she filled a glass of water, and she drank it slowly, and she looked out the narrow kitchen window at the slice of sky above the buildings opposite, which held the particular quality of city night, never fully dark, always ambient. The collective light of 9 million people doing what people do in the hours after the day has officially concluded. She thought about her father, about a man she had known for 19 years and had been understanding, apparently, for 32 more. About a lesson given in the early years of her life that she had carried forward through every room she'd ever entered, reading, reading, always reading, without understanding until tonight that the reading was an inheritance and not just a survival strategy. She thought about the ring in her pocket, which she had carried since Ferreira placed it on the table, and which she had not put on because she did not yet know what putting it on would mean in the morning when the morning came with its specific requirements. She took it out and held it in her palm and looked at it in the kitchen light. Old gold, institutional weight, the kind of object that carried decades of meaning that would now need to be renegotiated into a different set of terms. She set it on the counter beside the glass. She picked up her phone and sent one message to a number saved under a single initial. It read, "He knew about the brownstone. 3 years. Chose not to investigate. Thought you should know." Marco's response came back in 40 seconds. "I know. I've known for 2 years. Didn't know how to tell you." She looked at the message for a moment. She thought about what it meant. Not with anger, she was past anger, was in the territory on the other side of anger where things are simply true, and the question is only what to do with the truth. What it meant was that Damien, for all his failures and all the specific cruelty of the previous night, had at some level chosen to protect a thing he didn't understand rather than dismantle it, had drawn a line around her invisible architecture and left it alone. She did not know what to do with that yet. She put it with the other things. She typed back, "Go to sleep, Marco." His response, "You first." She put the phone down. She went to the table and sat down, and she opened her laptop and she began to write. Not documentation, not a legal memo, not the tactical shorthand of crisis management. What she wrote was the structural proposal she had been building toward all day, in the parts of her mind not occupied by the immediate. The document that began with what an organization was for and moved toward what it could become. The legal framework that would give the network's humanitarian function explicit protection. The governance structure that would distribute authority rather than concentrate it. The institutional design that would make the work outlast any single person's involvement in it. She wrote for 2 hours. The document grew, and she let it grow without forcing it to a shape, let the structure emerge from the requirements rather than imposing the requirements on a pre-existing structure, because she had learned over 12 years that the best architecture is the kind that comes from the ground up, from the actual needs of the people it is designed to serve, not from the top down. At some point, Marco came in with the quiet of a man who had his own key and had had it for years, and he made coffee in the kitchen without speaking and set a cup beside the laptop and sat down at the table with his own cup and his phone, and he did his work and she did hers, and neither of them said anything for a long time, because there was nothing that needed to be said that the shared silence wasn't already saying more accurately. Outside, the city moved through its night. She thought about what Reinhardt had called her when his composure finally broke. Invisible. She thought about whether that was the right word or whether it was only the word available to someone who had not been paying the right kind of attention. She thought about her father and about Ferreira carrying 32 years of a specific weight and about the girls asleep against an old man's shoulders in an armchair in the small hours of the morning. She thought about Celeste driving 3 hours on a dark highway toward a room where she had nothing to gain and everything to lose except the thing that apparently mattered enough to make the drive. She thought about the chandeliers that were too bright. She thought about what the estate would look like when it was restored, the gardens specifically. The way the morning came into those gardens when the weather was right, the particular quality of the light in the early hours before the day had made its full demands, when it was possible to stand in a space and see it for what it actually was, rather than what it was required to be. She thought about the council, about what Ferreira had said, You're something we don't have a word for yet. She thought about building a word, about building the institution that the word would eventually describe, about doing it openly this time, not in the margins but in the center, not invisible but deliberate, with all the exposure and difficulty and visibility that the center required. She thought about her father doing this in the dark 32 years ago and being removed from it by people who were afraid of what it could become. And she understood that what it could become was what she was building right now, and that the 32 years between his version and hers were not lost time, but accumulated pressure, the kind that forms something harder and more durable than what you start with. She finished the document at 2 in the morning, 47 pages, incomplete, the beginning of something rather than the thing itself, which was exactly what it should be at this stage, because the thing itself would be built in rooms with other people, with Ferreira and Castellano and Webb and the network's own coordinators and whoever else the process required. And it would take months, and it would not be clean, and there would be negotiations that cost her things. She didn't yet know she would have to give up, and there would be days when the visibility felt like exposure, and the exposure felt like danger, and she would have to hold the distinction between those things carefully because they were not the same. She saved the document. She closed the laptop. Marco had fallen asleep in his chair at some point in the last hour, his phone still in his hand, his coffee cup empty beside him, his face in the unguarded rest of someone who has earned it. She looked at him for a moment, 63 years old and loyal in a way that the word loyalty had never fully contained, loyal in the way that some people are simply constitutionally aligned with a certain kind of work and a certain kind of person, and go toward that alignment the way water goes toward the places the ground has prepared for it. She left him sleeping, and she went upstairs to the room she had used during the night's crisis, and she sat on the edge of the bed, and she took the pearls from her coat pocket where she had placed them after leaving them on the kitchen table in Connecticut. She had picked them up, in the end, not because she had changed her decision about what they represented, but because they had belonged to Damien's mother, and Damien's mother had been a woman who understood what it meant to hold things together in the dark. And the pearls deserved to be somewhere considered rather than left on a kitchen table in Connecticut. She set them on the bedside table and looked at them for a moment. Then she lay down and she closed her eyes, and outside the city did what it always did, indifferent and continuous and full of people living inside their own invisible architectures, most of them unknown to each other, most of them building something or protecting something or simply enduring the specific weight of being alive inside a world that does not pause for individual reckoning, regardless of how large that reckoning is. She had built this once in the dark. She had held it through a night that tried to take it apart and found that it held. She understood now that the holding had always been the proof, not of what she was capable of, but of what the thing itself was made of, what 12 years of careful, invisible work had produced when the pressure finally arrived to test it. In the morning, there would be Ferreira and the council, and Webb and the structural proposal, and the legitimate holdings, and Damien's attorney, and the 100 immediate things that a world in the early stages of reconfiguring itself produces in abundance. There would be the work of building in the open what she had spent 12 years building in the dark, which was harder and more exposed and more necessary. There would be all of it. But that was morning. For now there was only the city outside the window, and the silence of the brownstone around her, and the ring on the counter downstairs, and the 47-page document on the laptop, and Marco asleep in the chair, and the particular quality of darkness that exists in the last hours before dawn, when the night is most fully itself, when the day has not yet made its demands, and the only thing required is to rest inside what is true. She breathed out slowly. She slept.